That necklace was stolen, a small voice said, cutting through the golden hum of the Manhattan Gala like a blade through silk. The entire crystal hall seemed to hesitate mid-breath. Crystal chandeliers suspended above the ballroom flickered in slow motion, scattering fractured light across polished marble floors and tailored suits. Waiters froze with trays of champagne halfway to their destinations. Conversations collapsed into silence one by one, like dominoes falling in reverse. At the center of it all, William Harrington, a 46-year-old American billionaire known for his real estate empire and quiet control over half the city's luxury developments, stopped mid-turn with a crystal glass in his hand. He had been smiling seconds earlier, engaged in polite conversation with investors near the grand staircase, but now his expression shifted, subtle at first, then sharpening with curiosity as his eyes followed the sound. Near the edge of the ballroom, partially hidden between a tall floral arrangement of white orchids and a column of soft golden light, stood Ava Johnson, a 7-year-old black girl with small braids neatly tied back and a modest navy dress that contrasted against the sea of designer gowns surrounding her. She wasn't moving. She wasn't smiling. Her gaze was fixed, steady, and unflinching, directed toward a woman standing near the jewelry display table. That woman was Isabella Grant, a high-profile tech investor in her early 40s, dressed in a shimmering emerald gown, a diamond necklace resting elegantly across her collarbone, catching every flicker of light in the room like it belonged there more than anything else. For a moment, no one reacted. Then a ripple of confusion spread through the guests. A few awkward laughs surfaced, unsure if this was some kind of childish misunderstanding or an attention-seeking interruption. William lowered his glass slightly, his brows tightening as he processed what he had just heard. Ava did not look away. She raised her hand slowly, pointing not with accusation, but with certainty. That necklace was stolen, she repeated softly, each word precise, as though she had already weighed them carefully before speaking. A hush fell deeper this time, heavier, as if the room itself had dropped several degrees. Isabella turned her head slowly, her lips curving into a controlled smile that did not reach her eyes. She gave a small, almost amused laugh, the kind people use when dismissing something inconvenient without acknowledging it. "Sweetheart," she said gently, tilting her head toward Ava, "that is a very serious thing to say." Her tone was smooth, practiced, layered with confidence that suggested control over the moment. A few guests nodded subtly in agreement, their attention drifting toward Ava with polite discomfort. A child, after all, could misinterpret anything in a room like this. But Ava did not move back. Instead, she took one small step forward, her shoes barely making a sound against the marble floor. William's gaze remained locked on her now, not on Isabella, not on the crowd, but on the stillness in the child's posture. There was something unusual about it, something too calm to be accidental. "I saw it," Ava said, her voice still quiet but now anchored with certainty. The ballroom seemed to shrink around those words. A waiter accidentally clinked a glass tray and immediately froze, as if afraid to disturb the fragile tension forming in the air. Isabella adjusted her posture slightly, her fingers brushing the necklace as though reaffirming its presence. "I think you're confused," she replied, her smile tightening at the edges. "This necklace was gifted to me tonight, by someone very important." Her eyes briefly flicked toward William as if to reinforce legitimacy through proximity to power. William did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied Ava more closely. The child's hands were still at her sides, not clenched, not shaking, simply present. Her gaze remained fixed on Isabella, not the necklace itself, but the way it had been placed, the angle of light catching the clasp, the subtle asymmetry that others might have missed entirely. Something about that detail made William pause longer than he intended. Around them, the guests began to whisper again, softer now, more uncertain. The energy in the room shifted from amusement to unease. Ava finally lowered her hand but did not step back. Instead, she turned her head slightly toward William, acknowledging him for the first time directly. Their eyes met. In that brief connection, something unspoken passed between them, recognition not of familiarity, but of attention. William had spent his life in rooms filled with powerful people, investors, politicians, innovators, all of them speaking loudly to be heard. Yet here stood a child who had spoken once, quietly, and had already altered the rhythm of the entire space. Isabella let out a small, controlled sigh, stepping half a pace forward as though reclaiming authority over the moment. "This is inappropriate," she said lightly, addressing the room now rather than the child. "I don't know what kind of misunderstanding this is, but I can assure everyone here that this necklace is mine." Her hand rested on the diamond chain again, but this time, the movement felt slightly more deliberate, almost rehearsed. William's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He did not speak yet, but the silence he maintained carried more weight than any interruption could have. Ava remained still, her voice not raised, not defensive, only steady as she said once more, "It was taken before you came out here." The words did not land like an accusation. They landed like a fact waiting to be tested. And in that moment, the entire ballroom, from the glittering chandeliers above to the polished floor beneath, felt as though it had paused on the edge of something that could no longer remain unseen. The silence that followed felt unnatural, as if the air itself had thickened around every crystal glass and polished surface in the ballroom. William Harrington did not speak immediately. His attention remained fixed on the small girl standing near the orchids, her presence cutting through the luxury of the evening with an unexpected gravity. Around him, guests exchanged uncertain glances, waiting for someone to dismiss the moment, to restore the comfort of normal conversation, but no such release came. Isabella Grant exhaled lightly, the sound controlled and deliberate, then shifted her weight with the ease of someone accustomed to being believed without question. "This is becoming uncomfortable," she said softly, directing her voice not at Ava but at the room itself. "I assure everyone, there is nothing to see here beyond a child's misunderstanding." A few polite nods followed, though hesitation lingered in their eyes. Ava did not move. Her small hands remained relaxed at her sides, but her gaze sharpened slightly, as if she was listening to something no one else could hear. William finally lowered his glass fully and took a slow step forward, closing the distance between himself and the edge of the gathered crowd. His voice, when it came, was calm but firm. "You said you saw something?" he asked Ava. It was not a challenge, nor agreement, but a request for precision. The ballroom quieted further, drawn into the exchange. Ava looked up at him directly, her voice steady. "I saw her near the display table before the necklace was on her neck. She was the only one close enough." A ripple of discomfort moved through the nearest guests. Isabella let out a soft, almost amused breath and turned slightly, as if addressing William privately despite the audience. "William, I understand your concern for decorum, but surely you do not intend to take the word of a child over mine in front of all these guests." Her tone carried a practiced elegance, the kind that softened resistance before it could form. William did not respond to her immediately. Instead, his eyes remained on Ava. There was no hesitation in her expression, no performative confidence, only a quiet certainty that did not match her age. He had seen hesitation in boardrooms, panic in negotiations, and carefully constructed confidence in rooms far more intense than this. But certainty, without performance, was rare. One of the guests, a man in a dark suit standing near the bar, attempted a small laugh. "This must be some sort of confusion," he said lightly, though his voice lacked conviction. Another guest nodded quickly in agreement, eager to restore comfort. Isabella used the opening. "Exactly," she said smoothly. "Children sometimes imagine patterns where none exist. It is nothing to be concerned about." She turned slightly toward Ava again, this time with a softer expression, one that might have passed as kindness to an inattentive observer. "Sweetheart, why don't you go find your guardian? This is not the place for games." Ava did not flinch. Instead, she turned her head slightly, scanning the room again, not in search of validation but in quiet observation. William noticed the movement. It was not random. It was deliberate, as if she was mentally reconstructing the sequence of moments that had just passed. He followed her gaze briefly toward the jewelry display table. The arrangement was elegant, carefully staged, with soft lighting highlighting each piece as if each one had its own importance. The diamond necklace now resting on Isabella's collarbone caught the light with precise symmetry, but William noticed something subtle he had not before. The clasp sat slightly off-center, a detail so small it would have been invisible to most guests, yet now it remained in his mind. Ava spoke again, her voice still quiet, but more precise. "The clasp was not closed properly when I first saw it," she said. The words shifted the room again. This time, there was no laughter. Isabella's expression tightened just slightly, the first visible crack in her composure. "That is an interesting observation for a child," she replied carefully. "But observation does not equal truth." William raised a hand slightly, not to silence anyone, but to slow the exchange. "Show me," he said simply. The request was not directed at Ava alone. It hung in the air like a command that applied to everyone present. Isabella hesitated for the first time. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Ava did not move immediately. Instead, she pointed again toward the display area. "There is a security mirror near the corner column," she said. "It reflects the table." I saw her hands before anyone noticed. Several heads turned instinctively toward the corner she indicated. The mirror was decorative, part of the ballroom's architectural design, but its angle did reflect part of the display table. William followed the line of sight carefully, his expression growing more focused. The guests shifted uneasily now, the earlier certainty dissolving into quiet uncertainty. Isabella straightened slightly, her voice sharpening. "This is absurd," she said, but the firmness in her tone now carried a trace of urgency that had not been there before. William did not respond to her immediately. Instead, he gestured subtly toward one of the event staff near the edge of the room. "Bring the security feed from the last 10 minutes, he said calmly. The staff member hesitated only a second before moving quickly toward the control station. The room shifted again, the energy tightening as guests realized the direction this was taking. Ava remained still, watching without expression. Isabella's hand briefly adjusted the necklace again, but this time the movement felt less natural, more deliberate. William noticed it, though he said nothing. The wait for the footage stretched the silence thin. Every second added weight to the room, compressing conversation into stillness. Ava finally lowered her gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in quiet patience. William studied her again, now with a different level of attention. Whatever was unfolding, it was no longer about misunderstanding. It was about what the room had not seen yet. The ballroom remained locked in a tense stillness, as if time itself had been placed under pressure. William Harrington stood near the center of the room, his attention now divided between Ava Johnson and the quiet anticipation building around the security station at the far end of the hall. The guests no longer whispered freely. Every conversation had collapsed into fragmented silence, replaced by subtle shifts in posture and cautious glances. Isabella Grant maintained her position near the jewelry display, her posture elegant, but the stillness in her hands no longer matched the confidence in her expression. Ava remained where she was, small in stature, yet anchored in a presence that seemed unaffected by the scale of the room. A staff member finally returned from the control station, holding a tablet. The moment they appeared, every head subtly turned. William raised his hand slightly, signaling for the device to be brought forward. The staff member approached and extended it toward him without a word. William took it and immediately lowered his gaze to the screen. The footage began to play. At first, it showed the ballroom from a high angle, capturing the glittering arrangement of guests, the soft movement of waiters, and the gentle flow of conversation. Isabella was visible near the jewelry display, moving with ease among a small cluster of guests. Ava leaned slightly forward as she watched from a distance, her expression unchanged. The recording continued, and then subtle details began to emerge. Isabella had approached the display table earlier than most guests, her hand briefly hovering near the necklace stand while she appeared to be engaged in casual conversation with another attendee. The movement was small, almost incidental, but it was distinct enough to catch attention when viewed in silence. A few guests leaned closer as the footage played, their earlier certainty beginning to erode. William did not react outwardly, but his eyes tracked every frame carefully. Isabella shifted slightly in real time, still maintaining composure, though her gaze flickered briefly toward the screen being viewed by the room. Ava stepped forward just one small pace, not to the center, but closer to William's line of sight. "It is after that moment," she said softly, her voice calm but precise. When the necklace was adjusted, the footage advanced. The camera angle showed Isabella standing alone for a brief moment near the display, her hand moving near her neckline before the necklace appeared fully secured. The timing was subtle, but now that it was being observed collectively, the sequence felt different. A low murmur began to form in the crowd, not loud enough to be disruptive, but heavy with reconsideration. Isabella raised her chin slightly. "This is being interpreted incorrectly," she said firmly. "I adjusted my necklace because it was not sitting properly. That is all." Her tone remained controlled, but a faint edge had entered her voice. William paused the footage. The room fell silent again, but this time it was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of evaluation. He looked at Ava. "Is this what you saw?" he asked. Ava nodded once. "Yes." She looked around before touching it. No one else was near the table at that moment. William replayed the segment, this time focusing only on Isabella's movements. The detail Ava had mentioned now aligned with what the camera showed, not in dramatic clarity, but in timing, in sequence, in intent that could no longer be easily dismissed. One of the guests near the front shifted uncomfortably. Another quietly lowered their glass. The atmosphere of the room had begun to change shape, no longer centered on disbelief, but on reevaluation. Isabella took a measured breath. "William," she said, addressing him directly now, "you are allowing this to escalate based on a child's interpretation of a harmless adjustment." Her voice was calm again, but it carried a sharper undertone of urgency. William did not respond immediately. Instead, he handed the tablet back to the staff member and turned slightly toward the display table himself, as if reviewing the physical space against what he had just seen. Ava's voice broke the silence again, but even quieter than before. "The clasp was open before she turned away from the table," she repeated. "I saw it reflect in the mirror." William's gaze shifted toward the decorative mirror near the corner column. He walked slowly in that direction, the room instinctively parting to allow him through. Guests followed his movement, their attention now fully unified. Isabella remained still, but her hand once again brushed lightly against the necklace, a motion that now appeared less like reassurance and more like awareness. William reached the mirror and stood at an angle where both the display table and part of Isabella's position were visible. He studied the reflection carefully. The geometry of the room, the lighting, and the positioning of guests all aligned into a clearer sequence when viewed from that angle. Ava followed at a respectful distance, stopping just behind him. "You were right here," William said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. The words did not accuse or confirm, but they shifted the weight of the moment. Isabella stepped forward one pace. "William, I think this is going too far," she said, her voice now tighter though. Still composed. "You are allowing speculation to replace reason." William turned slightly back toward her, his expression unreadable. The room held its breath again, waiting for the next movement, the next word, the next decision that would determine the direction of everything that followed. William Harrington remained still for a long moment, his gaze shifting between the mirrored reflection and Isabella Grant standing near the jewelry display. The air inside the crystal hall felt heavier now, not from silence alone, but from the collective awareness that something irreversible had begun. Guests no longer looked at each other for reassurance. Instead, their attention remained fixed on William, waiting for his next word, as if his reaction would define reality itself. Ava Johnson stood quietly behind him, her small frame steady, her eyes still focused on the necklace as though the truth was not something she needed to defend, but something that simply existed. Isabella took another step forward, her voice now softer but edged with urgency. "William, this is becoming unreasonable," she said, carefully choosing each word. "You are allowing speculation from a child to override basic understanding." Her hand hovered near her collarbone again, not adjusting the necklace this time, but resting on it as if reaffirming its legitimacy through touch. William finally turned fully toward her. His expression was no longer neutral. It carried a measured seriousness that shifted the energy in the room. "I am not relying on speculation," he said calmly. His voice did not rise, but it cut through the surrounding noise with clarity. "I am observing sequence and verification." A faint murmur moved through the guests again, quieter than before, more uncertain in tone. Isabella's composure tightened. "Sequence can be misinterpreted," she replied quickly, "especially when influenced by suggestion." She glanced briefly toward Ava as she spoke, But William raised a hand slightly, not in dismissal, but in control of the conversation's direction. "Let us proceed carefully," he said. The room responded instantly to that shift. Even the smallest movement from William Harrington carried authority, and now that authority was no longer aligned with Isabella by default. He turned slightly and gestured toward Ava. "Tell me exactly what you saw, without assumption." Ava nodded once. She did not hesitate. "She was standing at the table near the orchids," she said. Her hand went near the necklace display while she was speaking to someone. After that, she was alone for a few seconds. That is when the necklace changed position. Her voice was calm, structured, and precise, as if she was reconstructing a moment rather than describing it emotionally. William absorbed the details silently. Then he turned back to the mirrored surface once more, studying it from a slightly different angle. The reflection now revealed not just positioning, but timing relative to movement in the room. Guests near the front leaned slightly, trying to follow his perspective, their curiosity now mixed with unease. Isabella let out a controlled breath. "This is absurd," she said again, but the repetition now lacked the earlier confidence. A child's interpretation is being treated as forensic evidence. William did not immediately respond. Instead, he stepped closer to the mirror and narrowed his focus on the exact moment the necklace was adjusted. In the reflection, the sequence was subtle but now unmistakably structured. Movement near the display, brief separation, then the necklace appearing secured on Isabella's collarbone. The transition was smooth, but timing created a gap that could no longer be ignored. A quiet tension spread through the room as more guests leaned forward, trying to see what William was seeing. One of the investors near the back lowered their voice to a whisper, but the sound carried enough to be noticed. "That timing does look unusual." Isabella's head turned sharply in that direction, her expression tightening for a fraction of a second before she regained control. "We are discussing perception, not reality," she said firmly. William turned back toward her. "Then let us separate both," he replied evenly. The calmness in his tone made the statement heavier rather than lighter. He gestured subtly toward the security staff again. "Pause all external conversation and continue reviewing footage from the 5-minute window before and after the event." The instruction was not dramatic, but it was absolute. The staff immediately complied, moving with increased urgency. Ava remained still, watching William rather than the screen now. Isabella's posture shifted slightly. "William," she said, her voice now lower, "this is unnecessary escalation." He looked at her directly. "If there is nothing unusual in the sequence, then there is no risk in verification," he said. The simplicity of his logic removed room for emotional deflection. For the first time, Isabella did not respond immediately. The silence that followed was different from earlier ones. It was not suspended tension waiting for resolution. It was evaluation. The guests sensed it. No one laughed. No one dismissed. Even the soft rustle of movement had disappeared. Ava took one small step closer to William, not interrupting, but remaining within proximity of his attention. He glanced down at her briefly. "You noticed something others did not," he said quietly. Ava nodded once. "People were not looking at the table," she replied. "They were looking at her." William absorbed that without comment. The second playback began at the control station, though the sound was muted for the room. All attention shifted again toward the screen. This time, there was no casual viewing. Every detail mattered. Isabella stood motionless, but the hand at her side tightened slightly. William did not look away. The room waited, suspended between interpretation and confirmation, as the sequence of events began to unfold again under closer scrutiny. The crystal hall remained locked in a suspended state of attention as the playback continued on the control screen. William Harrington stood slightly forward of the crowd, his eyes fixed on every frame with measured intensity. Ava Johnson stayed just behind him, still and observant, while Isabella Grant remained near the jewelry display, her posture controlled but no longer effortless. The atmosphere had shifted from social elegance to concentrated scrutiny, where even the smallest movement felt amplified under the weight of observation. On the screen, the security footage advanced frame by frame. The moment in question replayed again, slower this time, revealing subtle transitions that had previously gone unnoticed. Isabella was shown near the display table, engaged in light conversation, her body angled away from the necklace stand. For a brief second, her hand moved closer to the jewelry arrangement, not forcefully, but with natural proximity. Then, a gap in movement appeared. During that brief window, her position shifted slightly, and the necklace was no longer on the stand but resting on her collarbone. The room collectively focused on that transition. A faint murmur spread through the guests again, quieter than before, but no longer dismissive. It carried uncertainty rather than judgment. William did not react immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the screen, narrowing his focus on the exact sequence. His attention was no longer on interpretation, but on timing. Ava's voice broke the silence softly from behind him. "That is the moment," she said. There was no one else between her and the table. Isabella turned sharply. "This is being taken out of context," she said, her tone still controlled but visibly strained. The necklace was already prepared for presentation. There is nothing unusual about adjusting it before stepping forward. Her words were careful, structured, but they now required explanation rather than offering it. William raised his hand slightly, signaling for the playback to continue. The footage resumed. Now the camera angle shifted slightly, capturing a wider perspective of the display area. Guests leaned in closer instinctively, their attention fully absorbed. In the footage, Isabella's movement toward the table was now seen in relation to surrounding guests. At the exact moment Ava had described, nearby attendees were engaged in conversation, their attention directed elsewhere. For a brief interval of approximately 3 seconds, Isabella was positioned closest to the display with no one directly adjacent to her. The necklace was visible on the stand. Then, within the next sequence of frames, her hand moved toward her neckline, and the necklace appeared secured. The transition remained subtle, but the timing had become the focal point. William paused the footage again. The room fell into deeper silence. This was no longer casual observation. It was structured review. One of the guests near the side of the ballroom spoke quietly, almost unintentionally. "The timing gap is consistent." The words carried more weight than intended. Isabella turned her head slightly toward the speaker, her expression tightening, but she did not respond. Instead, she looked toward William. "You are allowing a child's assumption to define your interpretation," she said, her voice steady but now carrying urgency beneath the surface. William met her gaze directly. "I am allowing the sequence to define itself," he replied. The simplicity of his response removed emotional framing entirely. Ava remained still, watching both of them without interruption. The control station operator rewound the footage once more under William's instruction. This time, a zoomed view of the display table was shown. The necklace stand, the surrounding floral arrangement, and the reflective surfaces nearby were all visible. William studied the reflection in the decorative mirror positioned near the corner column. Ava stepped slightly closer again. "That mirror shows the angle of her hand," she said quietly. "It reflects what the camera does not capture directly." William adjusted his position to align with her observation. The mirrored angle now showed Isabella's proximity to the display from a different perspective, reinforcing the timing sequence already seen in the footage. The combination of direct recording and reflection created a layered view that removed earlier ambiguity. The room reacted with restrained silence. No one spoke immediately. The shift was no longer based on opinion but on alignment of observation. Isabella took a small step forward, her composure still intact but clearly under strain. "William," she said again, this time more firmly, "you are building certainty on selective interpretation. This is not how factual conclusions are drawn." William turned slightly toward her. His expression remained calm, but his voice carried finality. "Then provide an alternative explanation for the sequence," he said. The question hung in the air without emotional tone, demanding structure rather than defense. Isabella paused. For the first time, there was no immediate response. The silence that followed was different from earlier moments. It was not suspense. It was absence of argument. Ava did not speak. She simply watched. William looked once more at the paused footage, then at the reflection, then at Isabella. The sequence, now viewed multiple times from multiple angles, remained consistent. Around them, the guests no longer shifted uncomfortably. They were still. The room had fully transitioned into a state of resolution pressure, where the next word spoken would determine the direction of everything that followed. The silence inside the crystal hall had become absolute, the kind of silence that no longer felt like anticipation, but like judgment suspended in midair. William Harrington stood motionless for a long moment after the final replay paused on the screen, his eyes fixed on the frozen frame showing Isabella Grant near the jewelry display. The guests around him barely moved, their attention locked on the same image as if any shift in posture might disturb the fragile balance of what was unfolding. Ava Johnson remained slightly behind William, her small silhouette steady and composed, her gaze still directed toward the display table rather than the crowd. Isabella stood near the same position, but now her stillness carried a different weight, no longer effortless elegance but controlled restraint under scrutiny. William finally exhaled slowly and turned away from the screen. The movement was calm, but it changed the energy in the room immediately. Every guest followed his motion instinctively. He stepped forward, closer to the center of the ballroom, positioning himself between Isabella and the audience. His voice, when it came, was steady and clear, without elevation or emotion. "The sequence has been reviewed multiple times," he said, "from multiple angles." The room tightened further. No one interrupted. William continued, his gaze briefly shifting toward Ava before returning to Isabella. The timing, the positioning, and the reflection from the mirror all align with the same conclusion. A subtle ripple moved through the guests. Some lowered their eyes, others held their breath. Isabella took a small step forward, her voice now more deliberate. "William," she said carefully, "you are interpreting coincidental alignment as intent. That is not evidence." William did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at her for a moment longer than before, as if weighing not only the footage but her reaction itself. Then he spoke again. "Then explain the gap in presence at the display table," he said, "and explain why the necklace transitions occur only during that interval." His tone remained neutral, but the structure of the question removed ambiguity. Isabella paused. For the first time, her response did not come immediately. The pause was brief, but noticeable to everyone present. Ava stepped slightly closer to William again, her voice soft but precise. "There was no one else close enough to adjust it without being seen," she said. "Only she was there." Isabella turned her head sharply toward Ava. "You are repeating what you think you saw," she said, her composure tightening. "That does not make it accurate." Ava did not retreat or raise her voice. She simply met Isabella's gaze briefly, then looked back toward William. "I did not think it," she said. "I watched it." The distinction landed quietly but firmly in the room. William raised one hand slightly, signaling for silence, not as authority over the guests, but to maintain clarity of thought. The room obeyed instinctively. He turned slightly toward the control station. "Play the audio from the surrounding microphones," he instructed. The operator hesitated only briefly before complying. The footage resumed, now accompanied by faint ambient sound from the ballroom feed. Conversations were distant, fragmented, but the timing window remained the focus. On the screen, Isabella's movement near the display table was again visible. This time, subtle audio cues from nearby guests aligned with visual gaps in attention. A conversation to the left briefly shifted focus away, laughter rising momentarily from another group. In that precise overlap, Isabella's proximity to the display remained unobstructed. William studied it without blinking. Ava spoke again, quietly, almost as if confirming rather than adding. "That is when the room stopped looking at the table," she said. Everyone was looking elsewhere. Isabella's expression tightened again. "This is an overcomplication of a simple moment," she said, her voice still controlled, but now carrying strain beneath the surface. "I adjusted my own necklace. There is nothing more to it." William finally turned fully toward her. The ballroom felt as though it had narrowed around the two of them. His voice remained even. "Then why does every recorded angle show the same gap in supervision at the exact same time?" he asked. The question was not rhetorical. It required structure, not emotion. Isabella hesitated again. This time the silence lasted longer. Guests exchanged subtle glances, no longer uncertain about whether something had happened, but uncertain about what explanation remained. Ava stood quietly, her attention still steady, as if the conclusion had already formed and only confirmation remained. William looked briefly toward the mirror again, then back to Isabella. "We are not dealing with perception alone anymore. he said calmly. We are dealing with consistency across independent observations. Isabella's posture remained upright, but her composure was no longer unshaken. She glanced briefly around the room, as if measuring reaction, but found no support in the expressions of the guests. The earlier confidence in the room had dissolved into careful observation. No one spoke. William took one final step forward, closing the distance between himself and the center of the gathering. His voice remained controlled, but it now carried finality in structure rather than tone. At this stage, he said, we either accept the recorded sequence as presented or we introduce an explanation that accounts for every visible transition. He paused briefly. So far, there is only one sequence that satisfies that requirement. The silence that followed was no longer passive. It was active, weighted with expectation. Isabella stood still, her hand no longer moving toward the necklace. Ava remained calm, her gaze steady. The ballroom, once defined by luxury and conversation, now existed entirely within a single unresolved conclusion waiting to be spoken aloud. The atmosphere inside the crystal hall had shifted into something irreversible, as if the entire space was now suspended between truth and consequence. William Harrington stood at the center of the ballroom, no longer looking at the screen but at the people gathered around him, his expression calm, yet firm in a way that quieted even the smallest movement. Ava Johnson remained just behind him, her presence steady and unchanged, while Isabella Grant stood facing them both, her composure still intact but visibly under strain from the weight of continuous scrutiny. The guests no longer whispered freely. Every sound felt measured, as though even breathing had become deliberate. William finally broke the silence again, his voice even and controlled. At this point, he said, we are no longer reviewing assumptions. We are reviewing consistency across multiple independent sources. His gaze briefly shifted toward Ava, then returned to Isabella. And all of them align. A faint tension spread through the crowd. Isabella lifted her chin slightly, her tone carefully maintained. William, she said, you are drawing a conclusion from a limited interpretation of events. There are explanations that do not involve accusation. William did not react immediately. Instead, he took a slow step forward, reducing the distance between himself and the center of attention. Then provide one that accounts for every recorded transition without contradiction, he said. The question landed cleanly, without emotion, but with absolute structure. Isabella paused again. This pause was longer than any before it. It was no longer a brief hesitation, but a visible gap in response. Ava remained still, her eyes focused not on Isabella but on William, as if following the direction of reasoning rather than confrontation. The control station operator glanced toward William for instruction. William gave a subtle nod. The playback resumed once more. On the screen, the same sequence appeared. But now the camera angle shifted slightly to include a wider portion of the ballroom floor. Guests could see themselves faintly in the background of the recording, reinforcing the reality of timing and presence. Isabella stood near the jewelry display, engaged in conversation moments before the critical interval. Then the footage reached the exact sequence again. A brief separation occurred between nearby guests and the display table. During that interval, Isabella's position aligned closest to the necklace stand. The transition, when viewed repeatedly, remained subtle but consistent. Ava spoke quietly, her voice steady. This is the exact window, she said. There is no obstruction during this time. William studied the screen without interruption. Around them, guests no longer shifted restlessly. Instead, they watched with concentrated attention, their earlier uncertainty replaced by focused evaluation. Isabella's voice tightened slightly. You are isolating a moment without context, she said. There were conversations, distractions, movement across the room. Nothing in that environment suggests intent. William turned slightly toward her. Intent is not what is being evaluated, he replied. Sequences. The distinction settled heavily into the room. The operator replayed the sequence again at William's request, this time slowing the frame rate. Each second expanded into visible detail. The jewelry stand, Isabella's position, the surrounding guests, and the reflective surfaces all aligned into a timeline that no longer depended on interpretation but on order of events. Ava stepped forward slightly, her voice still calm. People were not watching the table, she said. They were watching the center of the room. That is why the moment was not noticed immediately. William acknowledged the observation with a small nod, still focused on the screen. Isabella turned her head slightly toward Ava. You are describing attention patterns as if they determine outcome, she said. They do not. Ava did not respond defensively. She simply remained still, her attention unwavering. William finally paused the playback again. The ballroom returned to full stillness. The weight of multiple confirmations now pressed into every corner of the space. He turned fully toward Isabella. At this stage, he said calmly, we are no longer dealing with isolated interpretation. We are dealing with repeated verification across visual and temporal data. He paused briefly, then continued, and none of the available explanations have accounted for all variables without contradiction. Isabella held his gaze, her expression controlled but no longer effortless. For the first time, there was no immediate reply. The silence extended longer than before, filling the entire ballroom. Guests no longer looked at each other. They looked forward, waiting. Ava remained still, her presence unchanged, as if the conclusion was not something being decided in the moment, but something already forming through observation. William stepped back slightly, allowing the full room to come into view again. If there is an explanation, he said, it must match what has been observed without omission. The words were not accusatory. They were final in structure. Isabella stood motionless. The necklace rested at her collarbone, no longer a symbol of elegance in the moment, but now an object under examination by every eye in the room. The crystal hall, once defined by celebration and luxury, now existed entirely within the tension of unresolved certainty, as every guest waited for what would happen when explanation could no longer avoid alignment with what had already been seen. The silence in the crystal hall had become heavier than anything luxury alone could produce, a silence shaped by expectation, restraint, and the slow collapse of uncertainty. William Harrington stood at the center of it all, no longer speaking, no longer gesturing, simply observing the collective response of the room as if the environment itself had become part of the analysis. Ava Johnson remained just behind him, still and composed, her small frame unchanged in posture but fully present in attention. Isabella Grant stood opposite them, her expression carefully controlled, yet the strain beneath it now unmistakable. The guests no longer shifted casually or whispered in fragmented disbelief. Instead, they waited in full attention, as if the next moment would define not only the outcome of the situation, but the credibility of everything that had preceded it. William finally broke the silence again, his voice measured and precise. At this point, he said, we are no longer comparing interpretations. We are comparing alignment across verified observation. He paused briefly, allowing the weight of the statement to settle before continuing. And the alignment is consistent across all recorded angles. A subtle shift moved through the room. It was not dramatic, but it was irreversible. Isabella's composure tightened slightly, her hands now resting still at her sides, no longer adjusting or reinforcing her presence. William, she said carefully, you are treating procedural variance as definitive contradiction. That is not a valid standard for conclusion. Her tone remained controlled, but the urgency beneath it was no longer fully contained. William turned slightly toward her, maintaining calm eye contact. Then provide a sequence that removes contradiction across all verified sources, he said. The question was simple, but its structure left no room for abstraction. The room remained still. Ava's gaze shifted briefly toward Isabella, then back to William, as if following the logic rather than the conflict. The control operator at the station waited silently for instruction. William gave a subtle motion of his hand. The footage resumed once more. The ballroom screen displayed the same sequence again, now enhanced with clearer stabilization and synchronized timing markers. Guests leaned forward slightly without realizing it, their attention fully captured by repetition that no longer felt redundant but necessary. Isabella stood near the jewelry display as before, engaged in conversation moments prior to the critical interval. The recording advanced in precise increments. Movement in the surrounding crowd briefly diverted attention away from the display area. During that exact interval, Isabella's position shifted into closest proximity to the necklace stand. The transition remained subtle, but now, with timing markers visible, It could be measured, rather than inferred. Ava spoke quietly, her voice steady and factual. This is the exact overlap, she said. There is no obstruction from any angle during this period. William observed without interruption. The playback continued, showing the moment when the necklace transitioned from display position to worn placement. The room did not react immediately. Instead, there was a collective stillness that followed understanding rather than surprise. It was the stillness of confirmation forming in real time. One guest near the side lowered their head slightly, not in reaction but in acknowledgement of clarity. Another adjusted their stance without speaking. Isabella finally moved her gaze from the screen back to William. "You are isolating a moment without accounting for intent or context," she said again, though her voice now carried less certainty than before. William responded calmly. "Intent requires inference. Sequence requires alignment." The distinction hung in the air with finality. Ava remained motionless, her focus steady. William gestured toward the mirrored column again, and the operator adjusted the display to show synchronized reflection data alongside the primary footage. The dual perspective now aligned without discrepancy. The reflection confirmed proximity. The camera confirmed timing. The room confirmed observation. William stepped slightly forward, addressing the entire ballroom now rather than any single individual. "At this stage," he said, "there is no remaining divergence between recorded observation and physical sequence." His voice remained even, but its structure carried resolution. Isabella's posture remained upright, but the tension in her expression was now fully visible. She did not speak immediately. The silence that followed was no longer investigative. It was conclusive in its stillness. Ava looked up briefly at William, then returned her gaze to the center of the room. William took one final glance at the screen before turning back to the audience. "Unless there is an alternative sequence that accounts for all recorded transitions without contradiction," he said, "the present data stands as verified." No one responded. The crystal hall, once filled with motion, conversation, and celebration, now existed entirely within a single unified silence, where every observation had converged into the same unavoidable conclusion, and nothing remained unexamined. The crystal hall no longer felt like a celebration space, but like a courtroom suspended in silence, where every reflection, every angle, and every recorded second had already spoken louder than any voice. William Harrington stood at the center of it all, no longer addressing isolated moments, but the totality of what had been verified. Ava Johnson remained just behind him, still and composed, her presence unchanged but now carrying the weight of absolute attention. Isabella Grant stood opposite them, her posture still controlled, but the fine edges of composure had begun to show strain beneath the surface. The guests, once scattered in curiosity and doubt, now formed a unified silence, as if waiting for the final structure of truth to complete itself. William slowly turned from the screen to the room. His voice, when it came, was steady and final in its structure. "We have reviewed all available footage," he said. "We have compared multiple angles, mirrored reflections, and synchronized timing markers." He paused, allowing the weight of the statement to settle fully across the hall. "And the sequence remains consistent without contradiction." A stillness followed that felt deeper than before. It was no longer anticipation. It was resolution forming without announcement. Isabella exhaled softly, her gaze steady but no longer assertive in the same way as before. "William," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "consistency does not eliminate interpretation. It only limits it." William looked directly at her. "Then present an interpretation that accounts for every recorded detail without exclusion," he said. The challenge was not raised in tone, but in structure, and that structure left no space for emotional diversion. For the first time, Isabella did not respond immediately. Ava remained still, watching not the exchange itself, but the shift in how the room responded to it. The guests no longer looked uncertain. They looked focused, as if the absence of contradiction had already begun to settle into conclusion. One of the event coordinators quietly stepped forward near the control station, lowering their voice as they spoke to William. "The system logs confirm no external interference," they said. The statement added another layer of alignment, reinforcing what had already been observed visually. William nodded once. Isabella turned slightly toward the coordinator, then back to William. System logs can confirm presence, she said carefully, but they do not define intent or context. William responded without hesitation. Intent is not part of what has been evaluated, he said. Only sequence and verification. The distinction now felt absolute. Ava finally spoke again, her voice calm but precise. Everything happened in the same order every time it was reviewed, she said. Nothing changed between recordings. William glanced at her briefly, then back toward the center of the room. The mirrored column, the display table, and the surrounding space all now felt like components of a single structured narrative that had been reconstructed repeatedly until no variation remained. The playback screen showed the final synchronized view, all angles aligned simultaneously. The necklace transition was no longer a question of perception, but of timing consistency across all sources. The room remained silent. Not a single guest spoke. Even movement had slowed to stillness. Isabella stood in place, her expression now composed in a different way, less defensive and more contained, as though understanding had reached a point where further resistance no longer altered outcome. William took a slow step forward, addressing the room one final time. At this stage, he said, there are no remaining discrepancies across observation, timing, or reflection. He paused briefly, then continued. And when all independent sources converge without contradiction, the conclusion is no longer interpretive. It is structural. The silence that followed was complete. Ava looked up at William, then toward the center of the ballroom. The guests remained frozen in attention, no longer waiting for additional evidence, but for acknowledgement of what had already formed. Isabella did not move. The necklace remained at her collarbone, but its presence in the room had shifted from elegance to scrutiny, from assumption to examination. William finally lowered his gaze slightly, not in defeat or victory, but in closure of process. The crystal hall, once filled with celebration and sound, now existed entirely within a single shared understanding that no longer required further explanation to remain in place.